Hi, students. Dr. Madewell here, and we're still on week 1, and we need to wrap up our mini lectures. It's time for mini lecture 2. We're going to talk about populations, samples, and variables. All right, when we talk about research, it usually starts with a question and a research question. So that means a research question is driven as a question and ends with a question mark. Most of my research, if you're going to read some of my research over this semester, and other faculties' research, but most of my research follows one research question. How are some people more resilient than others? Isn't that interesting? Someone can experience a trauma and be affected in such a way that they can't leave the house. And others could have had many traumas, even since childhood, and they seem okay on the outside. So interesting. Well, when we're talking about research, and we do develop a research question, we want to figure out who do we want to study. We can't study everyone, so we have to decide who we're going to study. And how we do that is, first we try to understand the population of people we're interested in. The population is just going to be everyone that we're interested in. It could be everybody in Durant, per se. Could be the population of Durant, would be every person. North, east, south, west. And here on this slide, this orange circle would represent, let's say, Durant. We're also interested in the word sample. A sample, one of these little stars, is a subset of the greater population. So we could say a sample, or one of these little stars, is an element or one person that we're interested in. We don't usually come up with a research question to study everybody in behavioral sciences. We want to know about individuals diagnosed with a certain disorder, or maybe on this slide, I talked about maybe someone in the military. Okay, so first we want to see who we're studying, and next we're going to see what we're measuring. And this means we need a common language to define our sample from our population. When we look at our population, these are just definitions, again, straight from the book, from the textbook I've written with my PhD mom and grandma. Our population, again, is everybody of interest. An element is maybe one person who meets our research criteria. And a subset of a sample would be, maybe 25 people, 25 elements, 25 people that meet our research criteria. So maybe a little small subset of the bigger group. When we are deciding on our research criteria, we need to determine what parameters to focus on. What specific kind of person are we interested in, or kind of people? Let's say if we have, if our population is all 21-year-old women in the US, then one woman is an element, one woman that's 21 and living in the US. Our sample might be 1,000 randomly selected women, and that's who we actually survey. The population could be millions of women in the US. In your handwritten notes, I want you to detail a group of people from whom you'd like to study. Then detail the criteria that would separate them from others. For example, do you want to study people who grew up in a violent home? If so, could they be men or women? Could they be from any racial or ethnic group? Could they be from any socioeconomic status? Think critically here. Enter your ideal sample in your handwritten week 1 notes to ensure you earn all your research participation points. Why do we use samples and not the whole population? The whole population is too expensive. We would have to have such a big research group, and we'd all have to fly and drive. And by the time, let's say, two of you go study California, by the time you get to the middle of California, we'll already have people who have passed and new births, tons of people moving in and out. So the job's never really done. If we want the whole population, it's a very time consuming, it's very expensive, and it's usually unnecessary. Because if we can set our research criteria tight enough and we can focus on a subset of people that have a commonality, what we can try to do is say this group of 21-year-old women, if we find out something about them, we could then generalize it onto all US women who are around 21 years of age. So we select a sample to then generalize onto the greater population. I picked this picture because it's a group of people knitting or crocheting. I just thought it made me happy. Hopefully makes you happy too. Now, we do want to know who we're studying. What kind of variables do we want to look at would be our next important question. A variable is any characteristic that can be measured. So hours of sleep, test scores, anxiety levels, etc. But we're interested in two different types of variables. We have an independent variable, and that's the variable that has some kind of a change or some kind of a manipulation. In behavioral sciences, we do a lot of quasi research, quasi experimental research. You could write that in your notes. Quasi experimental research, QUASI. Quasi experimental research means we might look at somebody who had childhood trauma, maybe somebody else who had adult trauma, and then a group who had both. We can't ethically say, now you abuse this child so we can research them later, right? We can't say, you go have somebody violate you so you can be in this study. Very unethical, right? So in psychology, we often use quasi-experimental designs for our independent variable, okay? Where we're from, we experience a lot of tornadoes and natural disasters. So we might have a group of people, we all summarize, say, who's experienced a natural disaster? Who's experienced a home burning down in your childhood? Who's experienced both? And maybe we see who has higher depression, who has higher anxiety of those three independent variables or groups. Our dependent variable is going to be the outcome variable that we're of interest in. So if in that example, we have somebody who grew up with childhood trauma, someone who had a house burned down, and somebody who had both, that would be, those three groups would be our independent variable. We can't manipulate that, we just categorize them, okay? But then what do we want to know about them that's different? Maybe our dependent variable here would be depression, maybe anxiety, the ability to maintain a long-term relationship. Those kinds of things would be great dependent variables for this example. On my slide here, for our independent variables, I have cat lovers and dog lovers. Kind of interesting to see who would have higher or lower depression. Would it be a cat lover or a dog lover? Okay, now I didn't say a dog owner and cat owner. That might be a different study. For your handwritten notes, I want you to draw out the independent variable and the dependent variable diagram here to ensure your credit. If we have a research question, does caffeine affect memory? Interesting. What would be the independent variable in this research question, and what would be the dependent variable? Write out your response in your handwritten notes for your participation credit. Next, we also are interested in continuous versus discrete variables. And I hope you're following along in your book and you can utilize any of these images or redraw them in your notes to help you out. Continuous variables, a great example would be height. Are we always going to be the same height? Not as a child, right? And then as we get a little bit older, we might shrink back down again. Our weight is also continuous, darn it, right? Distance, time. These are things that are changeable. Okay. And so we measure them in a continuous form. Discrete variables are fixed. A lot of them we're born with. Aspects of our identity, we're male, female, maybe the color of your skin, um, uh, your major, that's not really going to change much. It could, but it's not going to change a lot. So they're more fixed categories. On your handwritten notes, I'd like you to think about, would a continuous variable be measured as an IV or a DV? Explain. The same thing for discrete variables. Would it work best as an IV or a DV? Explain in your notes. Now, why this matters in psychology and behavioral sciences, knowing our variable types helps us choose the right statistical test, and we're going to get to that. It also is going to help us avoid errors in data interpretation. We don't want our dependent variable to be categorical because we can't do much with that. We really want our dependent variable to be continuous. And it would be better if our independent variable were like what we talked about, maybe childhood trauma, adult trauma, and both. Okay, we could look at those as independent variables, and then our dependent variable would be great if it's depression or anxiety, something that kind of moves and continues to change as the day goes by. So thinking about all of this helps us avoid errors in data interpretation. Also, it helps us communicate our results clearly so we can be right on target. For a quick recap, key terms from this mini lecture: population versus sample versus element. This will be great questions for the midterm. Also, we talked about variable. What's a variable and what's independent versus dependent variables? And we talked about continuous versus discrete types of variables. We're going to talk about more on measurement. And I want you to make sure this week that you're writing out your handwritten notes, getting that ready for Sunday, and also doing your homework and working on the discussion board. If you have any questions, let me know. And hopefully you're building blocks of knowledge. Maybe this is some type of a review from your biology class that you might have had a few years ago. But make sure you're reading the book so we can dig deeper and learn a little bit more about different types of variables in Lecture 3. Thank y'all very much. I appreciate your time.